I'd like to call the hearing to order. We want to welcome our first panel, and I'd like to recognize myself for to begin 5 minutes for an opening statement. Good morning. The subcommittee is now in order, and I want to recognize myself and for 5 minutes. Today marks the fourth hearing we have had on CFATS and the third consecutive one we have had since I became the subcommittee chairman. Sadly, it has been a very painful process to see how badly CFATS had fallen short of our expectations and to see the struggle both inside the DHS as well as externally to get the program back on track. There are some positive reports about progress from DHS, GAO, and the regulated stakeholders, but we've uncovered more details showing that in key areas, the suggested progress is not what we had hoped. I think strides have been made to remedy many of the managerial concerns of 1 year ago, and some of our testimony will suggest communication lines have been opened in a way that could lead to longer-term achievements for the program. By many accounts, Infrastructure Security Compliance Division Director David Wolf deserves a great deal of credit. Mr. Wolf, we appreciate your tireless, consistent, candid, and long-standing commitment to improving CFATS when others could not. I also think this process is merely meant to get us back to a semi-functional program, not a perfect or fully implemented program. Unfortunately, underlying programmatic issues we discussed in the last hearing, such as the fact that CFATS risk assessment falls far short of DHS's own National Infrastructure Protection Plan and the CFATS regulations, and the long time frame for evaluating site security plans, despite the incomplete risk assessment, continue to threaten the credibility of the program not only on the Hill, but with regulated stakeholders who are confused by many decisions made within the program. As Chairman Upton has said before to DHS, we are all on the same side. The enemy here is the terrorist who would seek to harm our nation. We need to work together to determine the best path forward for CFATS and its reauthorization. But we can't do it so if we aren't fully informed and in a way that verifies the details coming forward. That's why we're going to have some tough and balanced assessment of the program delivered by DHS and the Government Accountability Office and the CFATS stakeholder community. Our witnesses today may not tell us exactly what we want to hear, but they will tell us what we need to know. I want to thank all these witnesses for appearing before our panel here today. I believe we are at a critical juncture for the success of the CFATS program in that the internal issues distracting the program are not now our focus, but rather getting the program right, functioning effectively, efficiently, as Congress drafted the law. Their perspective will be crucial in getting serious questions answered by the program and our ability to work together. And with that, I'd like to yield 1 minute to the gentleman from Texas, Mr. Barton.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, for holding this hearing today. 2 years in a row, this subcommittee's convened a hearing to discuss the concerns with the CFATS program. Last year, we became aware of an internal DHS memorandum which detailed an array of management flaws and achievement gaps with that program. One of the witnesses today was a co-author. When news of these problems surfaced, several members of Congress, including myself, asked the GAO to determine what actions DHS was taking to address the problems. We learned in the GAO report that resulted of a 94-item action plan that DHS developed to address those various issues. I understand today that the most egregious examples of waste of taxpayer dollars have been addressed, but there's still work to do. We're at a critical juncture. DHS has been reviewing information since 2007 by operators of over 40,000 facilities. By January of this year, they'd identified about 4,400 as high-risk facilities. Of those, about 90% were tier-based on the risk that they presented, meaning that they would have to submit site security plans for DHS review. We now know that there have been significant errors in the risk assessment methodology. We also know that only a few dozen of the 3,100 high-risk security plans have been reviewed and approved. There's much work to be done. I hope this hearing will facilitate some of that work. Thank you for the hearing, and thank you for the time, and I yield back.
Gentleman yields back his time. Chair now recognizes the ranking member of the subcommittee, Mr. Tomko, for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chair, and good morning, and thank you to our chair for convening this hearing, and certainly to our witnesses for participating today and providing your insight and offering very important information. Ensuring the safety of our citizens and avoiding serious disruption of our economy requires us to remain vigilant and to anticipate potential targets and actions of violent individuals and groups. The goal of the Chemical Facility Anti-Terrorism Standards, the CFATS program, is to ensure that chemical facilities have robust plans to prevent terrorists from sabotaging them and to minimize the impacts should that prevention fail. 2 years ago, an internal memorandum revealed serious problems with the CFATS program. While some progress has been made to address some of the shortcomings, there is still much more work to be done. That work surely falls to the Department of Homeland Security, clearly having more work to do, but also it falls to Congress. Congress created the Department of Homeland Security in 2002 and charged DHS with coordinating federal policy to protect this nation's critical infrastructure. This is a complex task involving not only the federal government, but a partnership with state and local governments as well as the private sector. Congress defined this complex and essential task of protecting chemical facilities with a paragraph in an appropriations bill. The deficiencies in this program are partly a reflection of our failure to come together and provide clearer guidance to the administration. The industry has been active in this area. They have taken many steps through initiatives such as the Responsible Care Program to develop and disseminate best practices to member companies of industry organizations. These programs are, however, voluntary. Private industry does not have the tools of surveillance and intelligence that which the federal government has. In order to be most effective, we must have partnerships working together, and the program must have the public's confidence that their communities are indeed safe. The public and the industry will benefit from a federal program that is developed with their input and in which standards, practices, and policies are defined clearly by the Department of Homeland Security. The CFATS program is not the only federal program regulating chemical facilities. Other federal departments and agencies have programs with longer histories and well-established protocols. There should be a consultation amongst federal agencies to apply best practices, identify gaps in responsibility, and to avoid conflicting regulations and policies. I hope this will not be the last hearing on this issue. This committee should develop legislation that provides clear direction to DHS, certainty to the regulated industry, and confidence to the public that the CFATS program is providing the protection we require and deserve. A paragraph in an appropriations bill that must be renewed annually simply does not meet those needs. I would like to thank all of our witnesses for appearing before us today. I look forward to your testimony and to hearing your views on how we can improve this most essential program. With that, I thank you, Mr. Chair, and yield back.
I want to thank my colleague, and I can guarantee it will not be the last hearing on this issue, and we'd like to authorize the program. So with that, I'd like to turn to my colleagues on my side and asking if anyone would like to submit an opening statement. Seeing none, turn to your side. No one. Thank you very much. Now I'd like to recognize Mr. Rand Beers, the Undersecretary for the National Protection and Programs Directorate of the United States Department of Homeland Security. Sir, your full statement's in the record. You're recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Chairman Shimkus and Ranking Member Tonka and other members of the committee. I appreciate the opportunity to be before you today to talk about the Department's regulation of high-risk chemical facilities. Let me start by emphasizing that the CFATS program has already made the nation more secure. The program has identified high-risk chemical facilities across the country. It's provided them with the tools to identify their vulnerabilities, and it has helped them to develop plans to reduce the risks associated with these chemicals. Since its inception, CFATS has helped 3,000 chemical facilities eliminate, reduce, or otherwise modify their holdings so that they no longer possess potentially dangerous chemicals and are no longer considered high risk. The significant reduction in the number of chemical facilities that represent the highest risk is an important success of the CFATS program and is attributable both to the design of the program as enacted by Congress and to the work of the CFATS personnel and industry. at the thousands of chemical facilities that we work with on a regular basis. Over the past year, NPPD has worked diligently to turn a corner and has addressed many of the challenges identified by the program's leadership. The CFATS program has made significant progress, advancing programmatically, while simultaneously addressing the internal operational concerns. Equally important, the Department remains committed to working with stakeholders and with the Congress on a path forward to ensure that the CFATS program continues to build upon the successes to date. Over the last 6 months, ISCD has made considerable progress in conducting authorization inspections and approving site security plans. When I was here in September, we had authorized 73 site security plans. Today, we've authorized 261. That's a 400% increase. In September, we had conducted 19 authorization inspections. Today, we have conducted 141. That's a 700% increase. In September, we had approved only 2 site security plans. Now we have approved 52, including 3 alternative site security plans. While these are significant achievements in the last 6 months, we recognize that we need to do much more, and we need to increase the pace at which we are doing it. And we are looking at potential approaches for increasing the pace of security plan reviews and inspections for the lower Tier 3 and Tier 4 facilities without sacrificing quality and consistency. NPPD will work with the regulated community to gather feedback and thoughts on how best to increase the pace of the lower tiers. For example, we've been looking with industry on the development of templates or corporate alternative site security plans, and we believe that the use of ASPs will significantly increase the pace and improve our security plans. We've also discussed ASPs with the Coast Guard and will apply the lessons that they have learned regarding their use of ASPs, to take your point, Ranking Member Tonka, about talking to our partners who also have regulatory programs. Regarding our private sector partners, the Department has received primarily positive feedback on outreach and communications efforts from the regulated community, and we will continue to address specific areas of interest to the CFATS community. For instance, recognizing that regulated facilities best understand their risk drivers, and in support of increased transparency, the Department is analyzing what aspects of the classified risk tiering methodology it can and should share with members of the regulated community. In fact, that particular question has been presented to the Risk Methodology External Peer Review Panel for analysis. And I might add that this is a peer review that includes private sector participation. And the Department is looking forward very much to the panel's recommendations with respect to this. The Department has also actively engaged stakeholders regarding personal surety. During the last 6 months, we've been listening to stakeholder feedback on personal surety, and we revised our program based on this feedback. We now believe we have a proposal which provides the regulated community with flexibility for carrying out the outstanding requirement for personal surety and reflects input from facilities of all sizes. This proposal balances the need to conduct thorough vetting of personnel for national security purposes with the desire to minimize the burden on facilities. Our engagement with the private sector will be reflected in 2 Department notices that have gone from the Department to the Federal Register and will be published in the coming days. I close with a note regarding the Department's current statutory authority to implement CFATS. As you are aware, the CFATS authorization currently extends through March 27 of this year. The Department supports a permanent authorization for the CFATS program, and we are committed to working with the Congress and other security partners to establish a permanent authority for the CFATS program in federal law. Overall, I'm here before you today convinced that we have positioned the program firmly on the right track, and I would be happy to respond to any questions that you may have. Thank you.
Thank you. Also joining at the first panel is Mr. David Wolf, who's the Director of the Infrastructure Security and Compliance Division. Obviously, you didn't submit an opening statement, nor do you have one, but if you want to have anything just for the record, I'd like to recognize you for a few minutes.
That'd be great. Thank you so much, Chairman Shrimkus. I'd like to thank you, Ranking Member Tonko, and the other members of the subcommittee for the opportunity to testify here today. ISCD has made great progress in addressing the challenges described in the internal memo and associated action plan that we presented to Undersecretary Beers in the fall of 2011. With strong support from leadership in the National Program and Protection Directorate and the Office of Infrastructure Protection, and through much hard work on the part of the talented men and women of ISCD, we've completed 88 of the 95 items outlined in our action plan. We've developed improved policies, procedures, and training to ensure that inspections are conducted in a consistent and thorough fashion. We've implemented an effective, streamlined SSP review process, a process that has greatly enhanced our ability to authorize and, as appropriate, grant final approval for site security plans. We've also done much to stabilize our organization and our leadership cadre by hiring permanent supervisors, including a permanent deputy director, and we continue to foster transparency and open communication throughout our organization. I'd like to recognize our workforce, which truly has a passion for the mission of chemical facility security, and I'd like to recognize also the American Federation of Government Employees, which represents our bargaining unit employees in the field and has done much to expedite its review of key policies and procedures over the past several months. In September, I reported that we had turned an important corner in the implementation of CFATS. I'm pleased to be able to report today that not only has that corner been turned, but we're moving confidently down the road to realizing the full potential of the program. ISCD and the CFATS program are moving forward in a way that will foster continued advances in the security of America's highest-risk chemical facilities. We've achieved a marked increase in the pace of SSP authorizations, facility inspections, and approved site security plans. As the Undersecretary noted, we've authorized more than 260 SSPs and granted final approval for 52 of those. We anticipate completing approvals of site security plans for facilities in the highest risk tier, Tier 1, by September of this year, and completing final approvals of Tier 2 SSPs by May of 2014. Reviews and authorizations of Tier 3 SSPs are now underway as well. However, recognizing that we must find ways to become ever more efficient and effective in our inspection and SSP review processes, we'll be looking closely at and soliciting stakeholder input on options to streamline the review and approval cycle for facilities in Tiers 3 and 4. I do anticipate that ASP templates will be an important tool to enhance the efficiency of our reviews. The American Chemistry Council recently worked with us to develop an ASP template, and we continue to work with industry associations such as SOCMA, AFPM, and the National Association of Chemical Distributors, who are all considering the adoption of ASP templates for their member companies. So even as we continue to seek ways to improve, it does bear noting that ISCD's chemical security inspectors are today providing compliance assistance to facilities and conducting inspections at an unprecedented rate. And I'm pleased to report that I've received much favorable feedback from our industry stakeholders about their experience with these inspections. As you know, and this is something for which I'm profoundly grateful, our stakeholders are not shy when it comes to expressing their candid thoughts and concerns about the program. So I'm confident that when I'm hearing positive things from industry about their facilities' inspections-related experiences, we're on the right track. I'd like to share one quote from Kathy Cross, the Director of Security for Phillips 66, regarding a recent inspection in Oklahoma. Ms. Cross conveyed to me that her facility's experience with the DHS inspectors was a very positive one, that the members of the ISCD inspection team were knowledgeable, courteous, and quite helpful in their collaborative approach as they evaluated the facility, its SSP draft, and plan measures. Continuing, Ms. Cross noted that the inspectors provided thoughtful comments and were receptive to alternative proposals for meeting security objectives. So ISCD continues to fully engage with our industry stakeholders, and I very much do appreciate industry's continued support for the program. Our stakeholder engagement continues to take many forms. At the facility level, in addition to inspections, we continue to conduct compliance assistance visits and other outreach to work with facilities as they develop their site security plans. We also engage with stakeholders on important programmatic issues. We continue to work on the development of ASP templates, and we're in the process of gathering industry feedback as we move forward to improve our suite of online tools. Also, as the Undersecretary noted, we recently concluded a productive and extensive series of discussions on the important issue of personnel surety. Ensuring that those who seek unescorted access to high-risk chemical facilities are vetted for terrorist ties is a critical piece of the CFATS effort, and one that we must move forward to implement in the near term. I'm also appreciative of the work done by GAO and the perspectives GAO has offered us on the CFATS risk tiering methodology and on the management and tracking of our stakeholder outreach activities. With regard to our risk tiering efforts, while I'm confident that our current methodology, with its focus on the consequences of the potential terrorist attack, is appropriate for a regulatory compliance program such as CFATS, considering ways in which our tiering efforts may be enhanced is something to which we are very much open at ISCD. I'm very much eagerly anticipating the results of our external peer review in this regard on risk tiering and any recommendations that may be forthcoming from the peer review panel. As for our external outreach, ensuring that we appropriately track and manage our outreach activities is an important priority for ISCD and one that we'll pursue. Thank you again for the opportunity to provide an update on the forward progress the CFATS program continues to make. It's an honor and a privilege to serve with the dedicated professionals of ISCD. I firmly believe we've made much progress in coming together as a regulatory compliance organization, and along with the rest of the ISCD team, I'm excited and optimistic about the future of the CFATS program. Thank you again for the opportunity, and I welcome any questions you may have. Apologize for the extra 30 seconds.
Oh, you're fine. Thank you, Mr. Wolf. And before I recognize myself for the first round of questions, I think just a comment for staff, especially I think we have some guests in the room, is that maybe we need to put up a placard that defines these acronyms. Because if you're visiting this room and you have no idea what these acronyms are, you're like probably listening to Chinese. So stuff like CFATS, Chemical Facility Anti-Terror Standards. We'll talk about NIPS, which is the National Infrastructure Protection Plan. We'll talk about ASP, which was in your alternate security plan. So we know there are a lot of you that are well knowledgeable out there, but we probably could do better by having a display of some of these acronyms out there. So I'm from the military a long time ago, so we were acronym focused also. So I'll recognize myself for the first 5 minutes of questions, and my questions will be directed to Mr. Beers. Mr. Beers, GAO says CFATS does not consider or analyze vulnerability, threat, or economic consequence during the tiering process. We knew about the vulnerability gap, but not the others. But for in GAO's testimony, Government Accounting Office, when would the regulated community, the Hill, and others have learned of this?
Sir, I do not know when the vulnerability issue surfaced specifically, but I do know that it surfaced within at least the last year as far as I'm concerned, as far as I'm aware. With respect to the economic consequences issue, as I was not present when the program was originally briefed to this committee and other committees, I'm simply unaware of when or whether that might have been brought to the committee's attention.
Yeah, so the follow-up is, had not Chairman Upton, Joe Barton, Henry Waxman not asked for this GAO report, we on the Hill and stakeholders may not have learned of the vulnerability gap. Is that safe to say?
Sir, that's certainly a conclusion that can be drawn from that. But one thing that I would add to that, which David and I have both spoken of, is that one of the things that we have asked of the peer review committee after our own internal review is that this methodology be looked at independently. Obviously, we're going to take note of the GAO's comments on this, and it is certainly our intention to have full disclosure with you all, and if some of the material is classified, we'll do that in a classified setting.
Thank you. According to the National Infrastructure Protection Plan, risk is a function of three components: consequence, threat, and vulnerability. We did this in the last hearing, and a risk assessment approach must assess each one. Have you analyzed the effect of not considering vulnerability for all the regulated facilities?
Sir, we have the rationale behind that is, well, we have...
Did your mic go off, or it's not pulled close enough?
Let me start over again. We looked at consequences and threats and gave them a definition in the tiering methodology, but because vulnerability was what the whole program was about reducing, and because we did not have the kind of data that we needed in order to be able to assign vulnerability factors with specific and differentiated levels, we chose to hold that constant tier on the basis of threat and consequence and ask the facilities then to come back to us with an indication of what their vulnerabilities were and to work with them on site security plans to deal with those vulnerabilities. The consequence of this is that the tiering works to set them aside by threat and vulnerability, and the whole end game is about reducing vulnerability or risk. So we chose to hold that constant in the tiering. We chose to deal with that through the site security plan process.
I guess in our follow-up would be, we think you've evaluated part of the threat, not the entire threat, and there's no economic process that's been defined so far, which is a part of that whole calculation. But you did identify in your comment, about up-to-date data. So what's the effect of not using up-to-date data, threat data in the risk tiering approach?
Sir, as we go through this process, if there is additional threat data or altered threat data, our intention is to include that. That's certainly something that we are talking with the peer review committee about, and my guess is we will get some different information. David, do you want to add to that?
I would. The tiering methodology as it currently exists is certainly very much consequence based. I think that consequence is tied very much directly to threat as we use the threat in the tiering engine. Targets that have a high value from a terrorist perspective in terms of the consequence, will also typically have a pretty high score on the threat side. We're certainly very much open to ways in which we can enhance the tiering methodology, and that's the very reason we're having this external peer review. But I think focusing principally on consequence in a regulatory compliance framework it is an appropriate way to tier facilities. If we focused heavily on vulnerability in the actual tiering, we would have potential situations in which a facility would tier highly because of a heightened vulnerability that it had identified. As a result of tiering highly, would put into place hopefully significant and successful security measures to address the vulnerability. The vulnerability would then be diminished, and theoretically that facility would tier out, not have those requirements any longer, conceivably have its vulnerability go up again, tier back in, and we would have sort of a roller coaster effect. So I think the way in which we in the CFATS program have woven the vulnerability factor into the remainder of the program in the facilities assessment of vulnerabilities, in the development of their security vulnerability assessments, and in their development of site security plans makes sense. That's not to say there isn't room for improvement, and I certainly anticipate we'll get some solid recommendations in those regards from the peer review panel.
Thank you. My time's expired. Chair now recognizes Mr. Tonko for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. It appears that the Department of Homeland Security has good progress to report implementing their action plan to strengthen the CFATS program, but I'm concerned that fundamental problems may still exist. I would like to focus on one of those concerns, and that was just being the focus of the Chair's address, and that being the tiering of facilities. CFATS is a risk-based program, meaning that facilities placed in a high-risk tier have to meet higher standards, I'm told, for security. Lower-tiered facilities then meet lower standards. An error in tiering could mean that a high-risk facility is not adequately secured, or that the owners and operators of a low-risk facility have to invest in unnecessary security measures. The tiering process must be, therefore, as accurate as possible. Now, the Department published a National Infrastructure Protection Plan in 2006, and I believe revised it in 2009. This plan discusses how risk analysis for terrorism threats should be conducted. Undersecretary Beers, should the CFATS program be consistent with that plan in the developed plan of 2006 and improved in 2009?
Sir, the National Infrastructure and Protection Plan is a global statement of risk. All of the programs in the Department of Homeland Security should be in rough alignment with that. But we also have to recognize that different sectors and different companies may have some specifics that cause some alteration or some specific requirement relevant to them and perhaps only to them. But as a general measure, yes, that's correct, sir.
So as a general measure, we say yes. And according to the National Infrastructure Protection Plan, risk assessments must account for threat, vulnerability, and consequences. But that's not what CFATS as a program currently does. GAO is critical of the fact that apparently DHS completely ignores the potential economic consequences of a terrorist attack when conducting a risk assessment. And GAO is not the first to say this. In 2010, the National Academies published a report requested by Congress on department-wide efforts to analyze risk. And the Academies approved of the framework in the National Infrastructure Protection Plan, but found that, and I'm quoting, many of the department's risk analysis models and processes are weak and are not on a trajectory to improve. According to Academies, the methods were not, quote, documented, reproducible, transparent, or defensible. These are very serious criticisms, and to address these issues, the National Academies made a number of specific recommendations. So my question to you, Undersecretary, is that did the Department ever provide a formal response to the National Academies report?
Sir, there was a response by the department to that. I can get you a copy of that. I don't have it at hand at this particular point in time, but we were certainly aware of the Academy's report, and we did respond to it.
Well, Undersecretary Beers, can you please explain the process you are currently engaged in to improve the risk assessment done in the CFATS program, and whether it will respond to the recommendations made by GAO and the National Academies?
Sir, let me respond on two levels here. Firstly, to go back to the original premise, which is that threat, consequences, and vulnerability address how one should be dealing with risk, and simply say, we believe in the CFATS program that we do address all three of those aspects, even though the tiering methodology, which is not the entire dealing with risk, only focuses on consequences and threat and holds vulnerability constant. But as I said in my earlier response to the Chairman's question, we believe that the vulnerability part of that equation is dealt with in the development of the site security plans. With respect to the larger question, I think that what we are trying to do here is work through a regulatory program which is different. The NIP was really written in association with voluntary programs, which meant that while we could lay out best practices or standards or thoughts on how to deal with this, it was really entirely up to the companies in order to do that. In the regulatory program, we have the ability to state whether or not their response is in fact adequate to the regulatory requirement that we have, and that makes it somewhat different from the framework in which the NIP was written. But let me also turn to David Wolf to add anything that he may wish to add.
Yeah, I would just add a couple of things. You know, we committed to do three things when we encountered some issues with the tiering methodology. One was to do an internal documentation of our processes and our methodology, do sort of an internal department look at the CFATS methodology, and to do what is ongoing right now, the external peer review. As we conducted our documentation, you know, we have tried to be transparent about what we found. We've talked through issues with staff up here, with our industry stakeholders, and have tried to keep everyone abreast of the progress we're making on the economic criticality piece of this, of the consequence assessment in the tiering methodology. In that regard, you know, I would note for the committee that we are actively engaged in trying to address the economic consequence part of the equation. We're working with Sandia National Labs on that effort. I received a briefing, I want to say a couple of months ago. Our expectation is that Sandia's work, and it's difficult stuff, assessing economic consequences of potential terrorist attack, will be complete early in 2014. We anticipate talking through the Sandia findings with our stakeholders. We're not going to proceed in a vacuum as we look to incorporate economic consequence into the model, but I do believe, as I think you do as well, that it's an important piece to the puzzle. So, we are going to continue to seek to improve the methodology. The thing we struggle with is trying to be a learning, continually improving program, at the same time trying to afford a degree of certainty to our industry stakeholders, who, for whom it would be difficult to have an ever-changing target in terms of the tiering. So, we have to balance all of that, but we're taking a hard look at it all.
Thank you.
Gentlemen's time's expired. Again, the NIP is the National Infrastructure Protection Plan for our guests who are now leaving. So the chair now recognizes the gentleman from Pennsylvania, Mr. Pitts, for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Secretary Beers, according to the NIP, risk management should help focus planning and allocate resources. How can you prioritize resources and manage risk if you don't differentiate between threat or vulnerability?
Sir, we definitely do differentiate between threat and vulnerability. What we have tried to do here is ensure that the compliance part of the effort, which is to buy down risk, it was measured against the threat and consequence tiering of the tiering methodology. So the whole program is designed to reduce the vulnerability to the American people, to the communities that surround those facilities. And every effort is made through the risk-based performance standards to help those facilities produce site security plans that in fact protect the communities in which they live far more than when there was no regulation on those facilities, which is not to say that they weren't trying in their own way to do that, but what we have tried to do is to provide a general way in which they can approach that, to help them or to give them thoughts about other ways that they might think about buying down that risk by reducing the vulnerabilities through their site security plans. David, would you add anything?
No, I think that that pretty well covers it. The vulnerability is, as I've expressed, woven through the fabric of the program in the security vulnerability assessments that facilities conduct and in their development of site security plans.
Given incomplete aspects of your risk assessment model, are you confident that the CFATS risk tiering approach adequately tiers facilities?
Based on the way that we have put forward the methodology, we are confident that the general model is correct, as has been indicated here. We are going to look at economic consequences to see whether or not, and if so, how that ought to be injected into the methodology. And we're reviewing the threat information as well. So this, as David just said, is not a static program, and we are looking for assistance and help from the peer review effort to see how we might do a better job. But as David also said, we want to do this in a fashion in which we are not constantly changing and moving everything, because industry also needs a degree of stability as they consider how to improve their own site security.
Now, why do you collect data information that you do not use. Regulated facilities are required to provide substantial information to facilitate the tiering process, but ISCD only uses a small amount of this data.
My assessment is that all of the data that we take in is valuable to the program, and it is it's useful as we evaluate not only the tiering and as we assign risk tiers, but as we look at evaluation of site security plans. So the questions and the information that's provided in response to those questions, I think, goes a long way toward prompting facilities to give thought to their vulnerabilities and to incorporate appropriate responses to those vulnerabilities and to implement security measures appropriate to respond to those vulnerabilities as they develop their site security plans.
My time's expired. Thank you.
Gentleman's time's expired. I would hope that he'll pay close attention to the GOL report, because they say obviously there's a lot of data that's not used, and that's the reason why that question's asked. 5 minutes to Mr. Green.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Welcome to our panel. Undersecretary Beers, in your testimony for today's hearing, you state that DHS will be publishing a revised personal security program rule next week. Regarding the PSP, are you able to commit today that the new rule will allow similar credential programs like the TWIC program for land-based, so we would have one ID for employees, whether they work for a company's land-based side or the water-based site?
Sir, you're correct. We have provided our personal security program notice to the Federal Register, and the Department has provided a TWIC reader rule requirement program to the Federal Register also this week. Those will be published, I'm told, next week. It takes that long to actually put it out. It will include the ability to use a TWIC card as a personal identification and personal surety credential within the program for those who qualify for the program. The larger TWIC reader rule will allow companies, facilities to know what kind of a validation system they have in order for those TWIC cards to be validated on as individuals pass into those facilities. That was, as you will recall, an original requirement of the TWIC, of the whole TWIC program, which has been operating, unfortunately, without that reader rule requirement up to this point in time.
Well, and we've talked about this for a couple of years now, and I appreciate the agencies doing that, because a lot of plants have waterside and land-based, and employees move back and forth, and most of the time the employees have to buy those cards themselves, and it just seemed like it didn't make no sense to make an employee have to buy two cards that really should be issued by the federal government. You only need one.
Couldn't agree with you more, sir.
And can you share what the efforts the department made to incorporate both employee and union interests? Because I know in my area we have steel workers that represent my refiners and chemical plants, a number of them. Were they involved in this decision or received input?
The earlier information collection request that was withdrawn during the summer was sort of open for comment across the board. We did not work specifically or discuss any of this specifically with labor unions.
Okay. Well, I know one of their concerns is that their members would have to have these two cards. And when does your agency anticipate to complete the site security program review for all the facilities, including Tier 3 and 4?
Well, we, as I mentioned, we're looking to be through with Tiers 1 and 2 by the first part of 2014. With regard to Tiers 3 and 4, we are looking at ways that we can increase the pace of the review. I know that GAO, looking at sort of the current pace, has projected it could take between 6 to 9 years. That's a pace that is, in our view, not an acceptable one. I think that we're going to continue to see the pace quicken. I don't want to provide a certain date because I'm sure I'll be slightly off. But I think as we move forward with the heightened pace of inspections, as we learn more about how to achieve efficiencies in the SSP reviews and the inspection process, we will get better at doing them and be able to inspect, review, and approve larger numbers of SSPs. I think the alternative security programs will provide a means to heighten the pace as well. So as those templates come into greater use, and particularly as they're used by multiple facilities within the same company, I think we'll see the pace quicken significantly. We'll also continue to look at the resources we have to do those inspections. We're bringing on board another 18 inspectors, which will increase our capacity. We'll continue to look at whether there might be a possibility of getting some additional folks on board as well.
Well, Mr. Chairman, I know my time's, but there's been a substantial public sector investment and private sector investment, and we would hope to see some of that they would have their security plans at least blessed on what they've invested literally hundreds of millions of dollars on, both, like I said, public money and private money. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Gentleman's time expired. Before I move to Mr. Cassidy, I just, for clarification, Mr. Wolf, and for the transcriber, when you said the 6 to 9 years, did you say it's not an acceptable, or did you say not unacceptable?
I said it is not acceptable. It's not
Okay.
an acceptable.
Great, thank you. Caught my attention there for a second. So now Chairman recognizes the gentleman from Louisiana, Mr. Cassidy, for 5 minutes.
Hey, gentlemen, thank you for being here. I understand that you have done a heck of a lot of work to address some of the issues, and I've obviously been a sharp critic, so first I thank you for your hard work that you've done. That said, you might guess I got a couple other concerns. The fact that you can, what's that?
I said I suspected you might.
The fact that you can buy down risk or buy down vulnerability by decreasing threat suggests that risk is some constant. You have some number for risk, however you calculate that number, that you would like to address. It's also my understanding, I think you've said earlier, the review panel will come up with a new model in which they will assess both the economic consequences in turn and life consequences and all these other factors in a more sophisticated fashion than currently you're doing. Are they going to have access to your data, this category of data that this compendium of data that you have, in order to see if the robustness of their model?
Yes, sir. The peer review panel has access to everything that we have, classified and otherwise.
Now, is it possible that that will show that what you're currently doing is, I suppose, that means if they're coming up with a new model, it'll show either that you're doing a good job or that you're not doing a good job, correct?
Well, I don't know that it's fair to say that the panel's charter is to come up with a new model. The charter is to, take a fresh look at what we're doing.
But if you don't currently have, I don't mean to interrupt, I'm sorry, just limit the time. If you don't have economic consequences in there, and I understand at some point reading the testimony or the GO report that population density wasn't factored in some places, certainly seems that you need a new model. Does that make sense? I mean, if we're going to include economic consequences, then what you're doing now does not do so, then clearly you need a new model.
Yeah. As we look to incorporate economic consequences, and I should mention that it's Sandia National Labs that's doing the work for us on economic consequences, but certainly something the peer review panel can and I suspect will look at as well. As we move to incorporate that into the model, certainly we would have to revise the model.
So you do anticipate giving them access to your compendium of information for them to check to see the robustness of the model?
Absolutely.
And will you share that with the committee?
We can certainly look at that.
I mean, why wouldn't you?
I don't see why not.
Yeah. Now, would you, if you decide upon this model as being that model which you should use, would you share it with industry?
The underlying information?
No, not the underlying information, the model itself, because if, Mr. Beers, you say that they can buy down vulnerability by whatever addressing in a greater way threat, I imagine that you have some, retrogression analysis and that you can plug these things in. Really, right now, it appears that there's a certain degree of subjectivity. Well,
Sir,
look,
we are committed, and that is one of the questions that we've asked the peer review to look at, is what should we share from the tiering methodology with them. Now, we have some parts of it which are current classified. We are also looking at the possibility of declassifying some of that information as well, because we firmly believe, as the program is matured, that the transparency of the tiering model is important. That will help them think about their own site security plans in a better way than to simply use the risk-based performance standards by themselves. The objective here is to reduce risk. The objective here is to reduce vulnerability, and we believe, as we have considered this, that kind of transparency is necessary. If there remains classified parts of the program, we will look at whether or not we can at least have some industry representatives, as we do generally with the National Infrastructure Protection Program, cleared to receive classified information, even if we can't make it broadly available.
So I'm asking now not to challenge, but rather for information. If you have a formula by which someone can decide what their relative risk is, you plug in these variables and you come up with risk. It seems to me that I don't know whether that would be classified. Listen, a 15-foot fence will get you here, and a 30-foot fence will get you there, and video cameras will get you here, and armed cars will get you there. So knowing that some of the information is classified, are the variables that you plug in classified?
Some of the factors that go into the calculation of the risk score are classified. But I would just echo the Undersecretary's comments that that fostering greater transparency for our stakeholders in tiering is one of our goals, and certainly one that we're going to pursue.
Last question: what is? I mean, you may have mentioned this earlier. When do you expect the panel to come back with their report, and then ideally to run some of this compendium of information to check out what you've been currently doing, and et cetera?
We're anticipating a report from the peer review panel this summer.
Okay, thank you. I yield back.
Gentleman yields back his time. Chair now recognizes Ranking Member of the full committee, Mr. Waxman, for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Today's hearing underscores the need for reform of this program, and in my view, this committee should develop comprehensive reauthorization legislation. Today, GAO will testify that it will take 8 to 10 years before the department can review and approve the site security plans it has already received. Additionally, the department must revise its risk analysis model, which could mean that the current tiering of facilities will have to be revised, requiring many facilities to begin the process over again. In the 111th Congress, the committee produced a comprehensive chemical and water facility security bill to finally set this program on the path to sustainable success. Mr. Beers, you testified in support of that bill, as did representatives of the labor community, the environmental community, water utilities, and the chemical industry. At that time, you said, and I quote, "Given the complexity of chemical facility regulation, the department is committed to fully exploring all issues before the program is made permanent," end quote. I agree with that statement, and I would like to explore some of those issues with you today. Mr. Beers, does the administration still support closing security gaps for wastewater and drinking water facilities?
Yes, sir.
Does the administration still support maintaining EPA as the lead agency for drinking water and wastewater facilities, with the department supporting EPA's efforts?
That is our position.
Does the administration still believe that all high-risk chemical facilities should assess inherently safer technology, and that the appropriate regulatory entity should have the authority to require the highest risk facilities to implement those inherently safer technologies if feasible?
The statement at that time still remains the administration's position, sir.
Since we worked on that bill 3 years ago, additional challenges have come to light. Specifically, the internal review and memorandum prepared in November 2011 found serious problems. The department produced an action plan to address these problems. That action plan included the formation of a task force to develop recommendations for legislative and regulatory changes to the CFATS program. My understanding is that the Department reports that it has completed development of those recommendations. Mr. Beers, when can we expect to see those recommendations?
Sir, I'll have to get back to you on that. I don't have a specific answer on that question.
Okay. Well, I look forward to you getting back and to have the record held open so that we can get that response.
Without objection, so ordered.
As the committee further considers the CFATS program, having your legislative recommendations for reforming the program would obviously be very helpful. Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Yield back my time.
Gentleman yields back his time. Chair now recognizes the other gentleman from Pennsylvania, Mr. Murphy, for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and thank you for the panel. According to the CFATS rule, a high-risk chemical facility is one that, in the discretion of the Secretary, presents a high risk of significant consequences for human life and health and national security and critical assets. Let me ask you a few comments on this. If, as a result of your work with Sandia National Laboratories and economic consequences are incorporated into the CFATS risk tiering approach, how will this impact the current list of regulated facilities, and do you expect more facilities to be covered?
I think it's hard to say right now. You know, depending on what we get back in our analysis of Sandia's work, it you know, it could impact the numbers of facilities that are covered in a few different ways. You know, depending on the weighting that's given to the economic consequence piece of the equation, and really the general fabric of the assessment on economic consequences. So I don't think I'm in a position today to forecast that.
Do we have? Can you give any estimates at all how much you think it's going to cost to incorporate the results of the Sandia National Laboratories work into the current CFATS risk assessment approach?
I don't at this time. Not without the assessment from Sandia.
Well, given also that it's going to take approximately 7 to 9 years for ISCD to review plans submitted by regulated facilities, how practical is it for you to expand the program to include additional facilities?
You know, we are going to, you know, first, you know, as I said, the 6 to 9 years is not an acceptable pace, and we're going to do everything in our power to pick up that pace. You know, I think, though, that it's important that we foster enhanced security for all chemical facilities that are high risk in nature. So, you know, to the extent the universe is of high risk facilities is framed and includes in the calculation of that universe, or in the formation of that universe, the economic consequences, and the universe grows, we will look at ways to make that work. As I said, we're bringing on additional inspectors. We're improving our processes and procedures. We're going to get better and better at this. So, you know, if that challenge presents itself, we'll meet the challenge.
I know we've talked about these things in other hearings that the chairman has conducted here. So, you're expecting about 30 to 40 site plan approvals per month. That's your anticipated goal for the future?
That is our current pace.
The current pace. Well, how many did you approve in January of 2013?
I would have to get that to you specifically.
February? Just last month? Any idea?
I would imagine between 20 and 30 in February.
So, but you said you expect 30. You're currently at 30 to 40, but you're half that in February. I'm just trying to.
Yeah, I expect it's going to continue to ramp up, because what we were doing more of in January and February was authorizing plans, and as we authorize the plans, we schedule the inspections. That's what leads to the approvals. So the approval pace will pick up. We anticipate by the end of September being up to upwards of 350 approvals. So that will be, you know, all of Tier 1 and partway through, probably about halfway through the Tier 2 facilities. So, you know, actually in this 6 months and 6.5 months from now, you know, we'll likely be doing about 50 approvals a month for the next.
And you continue to, you have a mechanism for continuous improvement as you go through these to speed them up. For example, getting feedback as you go through these approval processes feedback from the people you've worked on with those, say, what could we have done to make this better, faster, thorough?
Yeah, we sure do. We're constantly evaluating our processes and looking at ways we can do things better.
Is that an internal process? Do you also get external feedback on?
Well, it's internal, certainly within the division, and the relevant branches within the division, but also we're talking consistently with our stakeholders. And I was able to share, one comment we received back during my opening statement. But we're always talking to our stakeholders about improving. And one of the things we've done to pick up the pace and to increase the pace of SSP authorizations and approvals specifically has been to include our field inspectors who are most familiar with the facilities in the authorization and approval loop early in the process. As issues are identified, those SSPs are kicked out to the field and squared away and kicked back into the authorization approval loop.
In my remaining time, I just want to ask real quick. We understand there's some documentation issues regarding the CFATS risk tiering approach. Can you give me a little information on where those documentation issues are? Is that something slowing you down too, or what are those documentation issues?
No, I don't think so. The documentation I referenced earlier was our effort over the past year to thoroughly document the tiering methodology.
Is that also improving over time? Thoroughly documenting it. So you're.
Yeah.
Well, I'm out of time here, I know, but I'll follow up on that.
Okay.
Other questions. Thank you.
Gentleman's time expired. Chair now recognizes gentleman from California, Mr. McNerney, for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Mr. Wolf, is the ISCD responsible for addressing cyber threats to chemical plants?
Yes, sir. Yes, sir. One of our risk-based performance standards, RBPS 8, relates to cyber.
So are there specific cyber threats with potential catastrophic results to human beings that you know of?
I think potentially there could be, which is why CFATS addresses cyber. It focuses within the CFATS framework on industrial control systems, on systems that can impact the release of chemicals, and on systems that can impact the security of a facility.
So how effective then is the DHS in addressing these potential cyber threats?
Sir, we have the best team in the country to deal with industrial control systems as announced by Security Magazine. The ICS, or Industrial Control Systems team that we have in our cyber office, is absolutely the best in the country. They provide regular assessments on request from people. We are expanding that program. It will also be part of the work that we're doing with respect to the executive order on cybersecurity and the presidential policy directive that came out, both of those in February. A major area of concern and a major area of involvement. We're basically teaching the rest of the government how to deal with this issue.
Good, good. In my mind, there's two aspects of cyber defense, protection and retaliation. Maybe that's not the way you look at it, but a kinetic attack will almost certainly involve a strong response from this government. But on the other hand, a cyber attack may not elicit a response. So the question I have is, are there rules of engagement for cyber attacks on chemical facilities in this country?
Sir, there are general rules of engagement. That's not part of the DHS activity set. That belongs to the Department of Defense, but we and the Department of Defense and the Department of Justice have a very robust effort to work together on a regular basis at all of those things short of an actual attack. I mean, we're, as you well know, in a sort of cold state of a lot of reconnaissance, a lot of intellectual property theft that's going on now that the three departments are working mightily to try to deal with. But the offensive side is a domain of the Department of Defense. We're aware of what they do in a general sense, but it's not part of our responsibility.
So, I mean, there must be some coordination, then, I mean, cyber attacks are happening on a continuing basis. Some of them are less of a threat and some of them more of a threat. And so what I'd like to get is some comfort that there's going to be a consequence to conducting cyber attacks at any level on facilities in this country.
Sir, I certainly can't comment on that in this unclassified setting.
Okay, Mr. Chairman, I'll yield back.
Gentleman yields back his time. Chair, now I recognize the gentleman from West Virginia, Mr. McKinley, for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. This is an interesting subject.
Mr. McKinley, can you turn your mic on, I think?
It's
oh,
on.
You do?
Yeah, this is an interesting subject. As an engineer, and as someone's worked in some of these chemical plants, I'm curious to learn more about what we've been doing and how long this has been going on. I'm just curious, first, I guess, do you feel, either of you feel, is terrorism threats on the rise? Is it status? What's happening in this country? I'm just curious.
Yes, sir. That's a very good question. I think what we have seen since 9/11, a continued threat within the country that has been primarily executed by individuals who have been inspired by the rhetoric of the jihadists to conduct acts within the country. Fortunately, we have been able to thwart most of them. Some of them just simply failed because they weren't very well executed. The Bureau has a very extensive program trying to detect this. Could something happen from overseas again? Yes, that's always a possibility, but that's a major effort that,
well, again,
we and other departments are working on.
Are the attacks on the rise? Threats, I said. The threats of attack on the rise?
The threats of attack on the rise. The threat and capability, because aspirational threats
should be just a yes or no, isn't it a yes or no?
And there's something every day. Threat and capability matched with one another.
Are threats on the rise?
I think at this point are not on the rise.
Okay, that's fine.
Are
so
not on the rise.
What is their objective? Is it just to have access? Or are they trying to just blow up a facility? What is the threat that you're hearing? What are they trying to accomplish?
So there's the local objective and there's the broader objective, and they think in both of these realms. The local objective is to have an event that is sufficiently newsworthy, sufficiently damaging, that it causes people to take notice of it and gives them credit for the ability to actually execute. So the broader issue, though, is to destroy, and bin Laden and his successors have been very clear about this, is to destroy the will of the West and the will of the United States to oppose them and withdraw from the region.
If I could continue with the question. Can you give me an example of a chemical facility that has been attacked successfully in the West?
No, sir. Unless you want to include the Aminas plant in Algeria, which is the one recent one that we have.
That's fair.
But other than that, I can't tell you.
Do we, if it's one thing, if they want to disrupt it, would we not pose a threat also in where the products that we're producing in these chemical plants, does it extend your risk assessment and valuation? Does that also go to the distribution centers and transportation, or is it just at the plant?
It's in all of those, sir, depending upon the holdings. Where the holdings are.
So you go the whole route. It's you're not just on risk assessment.
If the holding isn't large enough to be tiered in by the consequence, then they're not regulated. But we do look at distribution centers as well. David, you want to?
But CFATS focuses on facilities. So there are other agencies that deal with the transportation sector. So the transportation of hazardous materials is covered by the Department of Transportation. Transportation Security Administration. CFATS is focused on facilities, but certainly including distribution centers. And among the chemicals of interest that we assess are, those chemicals that could be successfully used by terrorists in an attack, as well as chemicals that could be released.
In the time frame that I have left, are the 4 other European nations, do they have something comparable to what we're doing here?
I think in many ways we are on the cutting edge here, and I think CFATS is a sound program and really a model that, were it implemented elsewhere, could be of value to securing chemical facilities and hardening them against potential terrorist attacks.
Okay, time's expired on that, but I'm just saying, even though they've never had an attack in Europe, they have not had an attack in Europe, and they don't have any comparable to this. I'm just curious.
I think Congress's assessment and our assessment as well is that high-risk chemical facilities pose a very attractive target to terrorists.
Thank you.
Gentleman's time has expired. Chair, and I recognize the gentleman from Ohio, Mr. Johnson, for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Mr. Beers, the Department of Homeland Security has adjusted its chemicals of interest release model because of errors in the formula. Are you aware of any other issues that may affect this or any other models within the risk assessment approach?
Sir, I am not, but let me turn to my expert here and ask him if there's anything you want to add to that.
No, our documentation, found some minor issues that we have briefed staff on and that we have addressed, and that have not led to significant re-tierings or significant numbers of re-tierings of facilities. So we are looking forward to receiving the report from the peer review panel and any recommendations for improvements they may have for the tiering engine.
Is this the expert panel review that you're talking about?
That's right.
Okay. Before you became aware of problems with the chemicals of interest release model, had you conducted any evaluations, Mr. Beers, of the risk tiering approach?
Sir, before we became aware of that particular problem, I am not aware of any reviews that had taken place. Having said that, it was, as we look backward on when that matter was brought to my attention, that there were questions about it a year prior to that. And the review that happened at that time turned out not to be an accurate review. So in that sense, there were anomalies that were looked at. Unfortunately, they failed to detect the problem that ultimately surfaced several years ago.
Okay. All right. In regards to the expert panel review, it's our understanding that the current expert panel review will not include a formal validation or verification of the model. How does that impact the value of the review?
Now, we've asked the panel to take a full look at the program, at the tiering methodology, and to give us an assessment as to whether it is in fact a sound methodology for assessing risk, and also to provide us any recommendations for potential enhancements and improvements to the methodology. So, I don't anticipate a formal stamp of approval, but I expect that they will let us know how they feel about what we're doing in the tiering arena.
But it's important, though, right? I mean, it's important to get that information, to get that stamp of approval.
I think that's why we're doing this. Not
But you
to,
said they're not going to, you're not expecting a stamp of approval.
well, not an
so
actual,
there's
not
no
an actual stamp, I guess.
Yeah,
But,
yeah.
I'm
We don't want them to just look at it.
Yeah.
We want them to give us a validation and verification that the model's accurate according to what we know today.
Yeah,
correct?
we want them to look at the methodology and let us know their thoughts on whether it works, and if there are ways in which it could work better. Yeah.
Okay. Given that you have not been able to review the site security plans for the Tier 3 and 4 facilities, how would you characterize how they're currently being regulated?
Well, I would just mention that we have begun review of the Tier 3 site security plans, and I've authorized some of those, but that is admittedly in the early stages.
Tier 3 and 4, or just Tier 3?
Tier 3.
Okay, so
We've
4
gotten
is not being included.
Tier 4 reviews have not begun on the on the SSPs. But I would say that across the tiers, to include Tiers 3 and 4, CFATS has had an impact. Those Tier 3 and Tier 4 facilities have gone through the top screen process, have developed security vulnerability assessments, have in most cases met directly with CFATS inspectors who have worked with them through compliance assistance visits and other outreach in the order of more than 3,000 such visits and encounters to work with them on the development of their site security plan. So I think in all cases, even without authorization or approval of those facilities, their security has been enhanced by CFATS and the work of our inspectors.
Okay. With that, I yield back, Mr.
Gentleman's time expired. Chair, now recognize the gentleman from Mississippi, Mr. Harper, for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Thank you, gentlemen, for being here. I know this is always an exciting time, but we welcome you and appreciate the insight. We're obviously concerned about security for these facilities, how we accomplish that, and as we're looking at the number of facilities we have, has there ever been any thought on your side of maybe just limiting the scope of regulating facilities only to the Tier 1 and Tier 2 facilities? Has there been any thought on that?
I would say that no, there hasn't. In as much as all 4 tiers represent high-risk chemical facilities and are a relatively small percentage of the total number of chemical facilities in the country, our assessment is that all 4 tiers are worth covering under CFATS.
You agree with that?
Sir, remembering that this is a consequence-focused issue, the original decision on all 4 of the tiers were that the consequences, the potential loss of life in the vicinity of those facilities, this is the primary reason, was significant in terms of the communities that surrounded them. So it's, as you well know, impossible to put a cost on the loss of even one life. So that's why this is such an important decision, and why we really haven't gone that step and said no, that 3 and 4 are not high risk.
Right. Let me ask this: as you're establishing these, you do a preliminary tier risk rating, and then you do further evaluation, the SVA, and you determine what the final rating is. Yeah. And once that is established, what is the review process after that? Is there a time that with that final tier risk rating that it might change in the future? How often are you going back to review those?
As facilities make changes to their chemical holdings or to their processes, they may submit a request for redetermination or may submit a revised top screen to ISCD, and we will rerun that and assign as appropriate a new.
So the nearly 3,000 changes that have been made, including tiering out, are a result of changes in holdings that have been able to be recognized in that fashion.
So is that possible review of, or change of a tier risk, is that something that you have to wait on them to notify you, or are you on a schedule? Do you go back and review those yourself, even if you're not notified of any changes on their part?
To the extent that our inspectors are out working with these facilities through compliance assistance visits or other outreach, you know, that's sort of the form that would take. So our involvement would happen in that way, but there's not a formal process for going back and
not a calendar date, say every 2 years, 3 years, we're going to come back and review. Okay. Now, it's my understanding if you have two facilities that have the same chemical of interest, one that has very little physical security next to a major, near a major city, and another stored with the same chemical in an extremely secure location near that same major city, they'd be tiered identically. Is that accurate? If it's the same chemical of interest, regardless of the level of security near that major city in two different facilities, would they be tiered the same?
I think that is that's accurate. The tiering is based on the potential consequence.
Right.
Of the,
is that a good way to manage and mitigate chemical facility terrorism risk?
Well, I think it is, in that the facility without the hardened security would, as a result of being tiered, have to look to implement security measures, develop a site security plan that would bring it up to an acceptable level of security.
The whole notion here is we want to level the playing field. So,
sure,
a secure facility is great. An unsecured facility is something that we want to change. We want to take the unsecured facility and raise it to roughly equivalent standards to the secure.
But it appears to me that perhaps we're discouraging high-risk chemical facilities from increasing security at their facilities and making them stronger. And I don't know if that's having the desired effect that you're saying you want. Is it having that impact? My time is up, so I guess I won't get a formal answer from you, and I yield back.
Gentleman yields back his time. And I've seen no other members. But before I dismiss the panel, I just want to reference the law, because, Mr. Beers, you keep saying a consequence, which is something we need to be concerned about, but that's not what the law says. The law says a risk-based system.
Yes,
Consequence is a part of that, but it's not the whole calculation. I think you caused more questions by this testimony today than answered questions, so I think we'll have them back, Mr. Ranking Member, to keep ferreting this out, because the law is pretty clear. And you can see there's still a lot of questions of how we're trying to define this. So we do thank you for coming. We do have the ability to offer written questions, as the ranking member of the full committee asked. And with that, we would dismiss the first
Sir, may
panel.
I respond to the question that you posed in writing?
Oh, you may. I'd be happy to receive
I think that's, if you're still not satisfied, then we have more work to do to
I
satisfy
think you have a lot more work to do. So, and we'll dismiss this panel, and we'll have the second panel. Staff, if I can get the back doors closed, someone, then we can move promptly. We'd like to continue the hearing and welcome our second panel, one-member panel, so we can put full attention to the testimony and answer questions. So we'd like to welcome Mr. Stephen Caldwell, Director, Homeland Security and Justice from the Government Accountability Office. Sir, full statements in the record. You're recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you very much, Chairman Shimkus and Ranking Member Tonko. Appreciate being here to talk about CFATS and the findings in our about-to-be-released report on the program. As you know, our earlier report focused on an internal DHS memo documenting management problems with the CFATS program and agency efforts to come up with corrective actions. But our current report focuses on agency efforts to do three things related to its core mission. The first of those is assess risks at the facility, which we've talked about quite a bit, review the site security plans, and work with industry to improve security. Let me start with the risk assessments. As noted by both the Department and GAO have established criteria for risk assessments, and these were not followed closely in the CFATS program. Specifically, the three elements of risk, threat, vulnerability, and consequence were not all used. As has been discussed, vulnerability has not been used, and even though DHS does collect extensive information on it. Some of the CFATS program criteria in its own 2007 rule, such as including the economic consequences, also have yet to be implemented. Regarding the site security plans, we found that the Department had a cumbersome process in place for reviewing these security plans, which led to a backlog of security plans awaiting approval. The Department has attempted to streamline the review process by doing concurrent reviews among its experts when it had formerly been doing sequential reviews. However, the impacts of this streamlining is not known because no metrics were kept on how long the old process was taking. But even with a more streamlined review process, as we've noted in our statement, we're estimating 7 to 9 years to improve those facilities that have been tiered. But our estimates does exclude some of the important parts of the regime as a whole, such as the compliance inspections. Regarding industry, the CFATS program has increased its outreach, and this was noted in the queries we made to industry associations representing chemical facilities. Industry also expressed concerns about the burden of submitting and updating information to DHS, as well as frustration in wanting more details on the how and why their facilities were tiered a certain way. Some of these issues, as has been noted, may be resolved in terms of the Department is considering what information on its tiering process it might provide to industry. Nevertheless, CFATS program could benefit from systematically monitoring the effectiveness of its outreach activities. In closing, I'd like to briefly look back at our previous report, which commented on the serious management problems within the CFATS program. Because of a lack of documentation in the earlier years, we were really unable to determine the root causes for a lot of those problems. And this condition was found in our current work. As an example, we found no documentation as to why the current incomplete approach to risk assessment was chosen. So to some extent, the current program is still recovering from some of those earlier management problems. But we have found the Department to be responsive to our recent recommendations and our current findings. We hope their positive attitude continues to result in improvements. And related to this, I'd like to note that my written statement is titled Preliminary Observations, because we are still awaiting Department comments on the recommendations in our current draft report. We will finalize that report once we receive those comments, and we anticipate issuing that in early April. With that, I'm happy to respond to any questions.
Thank you, Mr. Caldwell. I'd like to recognize myself for 5 minutes for the first round of questions. You were in here for the last panel and probably listened to my last exchange based upon the language of the law. Could you understand my frustration with the question based upon what members had said before about the formula for risk, and if there's two variables that are undefined, how do you identify risk?
Yeah, I guess I agree with your point. The law calls for an assessment of risk, not of consequence. I think the DHS response we've heard today kind of indicates that the exclusion of vulnerability was part of a well laid out and thoughtful methodology and analysis that they used from the start. We certainly found no evidence of this. I mean, our early discussions with methodology with them last year indicated the officials did not know why the current methodology was picked or why vulnerability was left out, and there certainly was no documentation on that. It was really only when we raised the issue of the lack of the consideration of vulnerability that the current narrative emerged that you heard today. So I think that really reinforces the need for an independent peer review, preferably earlier in the process than now, because of the problems they'll have if they find major changes. And I have some other comments on peer review I can make as well.
Did you get any comfort from the response on that the formula is being reviewed by Sandia, and that I think the frustration from my end was that, and we might take it, we might consider it. I mean, it was pretty vague as to whether all this work that they would even consider it as part of a fix to the formula.
Yes, let me make two comments on the peer review. I think based on our work today, and they've been sharing a lot of information with us, but we're still not sure how much of a free hand and leeway this new peer review is going to have, this expert panel. Will they have the leeway to really start from scratch and kind of come up with fundamental changes from the model if they think they're needed? And then, of course, we're also not really sure, and the department really hasn't committed to really how they would receive any major recommendations for changes because of impacts that could have on the peering process. So that's what I'll call the peer review's need to do a review of the methodology. What the peer review would also need to do to be comprehensive would be what's called the V&V, or a verification and validation. We know that there were some miscalculations found in the formula. This did lead to the re-tiering of several facilities. Also, in the course of our work, we found out there was an omission of certain locations, such as Hawaii, Alaska, and Puerto Rico, from the data and the model calculations. And they don't think this will lead to any changes in tiering. But, I mean, together they certainly don't give us a warm, fuzzy feeling that they've looked at the actual mechanics of the model to make sure that even if the methodology is correct, that the model is working the way it was intended to. So it's also important that the peer review do a V&V, a verification and validation, to actually look at the model, play with the numbers, do calculations, ensure they're correct, and maybe do some sensitivity analysis as well.
Well, and just kind of following up on this line of questions, because it was asked by one of my colleagues on data collection, what's it used for? Again, a pretty vague answer by our first panel as to what they really needed, what they had, and why they had it. You found that owners and operators were spending unnecessary resources complying with CFATS data collection requirements. Can you elaborate on what your findings?
Well, I'll say two things. I think whether the industry feels that they misspent funds or wasted funds, I'll leave maybe for the third panel. You can ask them that. But in terms of the question about whether all this vulnerability data was useful that the department is capturing but is not using, I think the way they put it is that it's data that then the facilities have been able to use or could use. So again, that's a question for the facilities. I mean, you could ask the facilities and industry.
But the facilities are the ones who provided the data. So it's kind of like, we got the data, we give it to Homeland Security, and then Homeland says, we got the data, here's your data because it's going to help you out. Or the collection of that data will help you out. When, I mean, it's just counterintuitive. I'm struggling with this.
We found the department was not using the vulnerability data at all that it collected from facilities. One other thing on that point, when we talked to them about why they were not using the vulnerability data, they said, well, they were concerned because it was self-reported and thus might be either exaggerated or not exaggerated. But everything in this thing is self-reported until, I mean, everything going into tiering about how much chemicals they have and where they have them and the method of storage, all of that is self-reported. So I'm not sure I agree with that distinction.
You're not helping me very much, but thank you. My frustration level continues to mount. So I'd like to recognize the ranking member, Mr. Tonko, for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chair, and I hope you can relax for a moment. I thank you, Mr. Caldwell, for appearing here today. GAO's analysis reveals significant concerns about this important national security program and the sufficiency of the Department of Homeland Security's action plan to address these concerns. We heard from the Department on the first panel that they are taking GAO's findings seriously and intend to follow the GAO's recommendations to strengthen the risk assessment models used in their programs. It seems that some of these concerns are long-standing. For instance, stakeholders have long called for greater transparency in the risk assessment process. I welcome the GAO's testimony today and have a few questions that I think would be helpful in providing the information we require. To the DHS methodology itself, does it appropriately, in your opinion, account for threat?
Threat's a little tougher, and so I think in our own analysis, we've been less critical of the department on that. And the reason that threat's more difficult is because the threat comes from a potentially adaptive adversary that can see where vulnerabilities have been reduced, or maybe vulnerabilities still exist, and change their targets. But even more so when you're looking at these chemical facilities, the facilities themselves could be attacked, or some of the chemicals at those facilities could be stolen or diverted and then moved and then used again in a population center or any other location. So I think it's very difficult. And also I think in terms of some of the questions about threat that were asked, there just really is not a lot of actionable, real intelligence that shows there is a threat against these facilities or specific facilities.
Thank you. And to that methodology again, does it account for the two minimum components of consequences, that being human consequences and economic consequences?
It does not include economic consequences. As the department has stated, they're now engaged Sandia National Labs to do that, but it's been a while. I mean, the rule came out in 2007 that specifically said that they would include that at some point. And if you look at the National Infrastructure Protection Plan, it does say at a minimum consequence needs to include both human casualties, fatalities, those things, as well as the economic consequences.
Mm-hmm. Thank you. And I would imagine that GAO has looked at risk assessments prepared by many different agencies over the years. How would you say the CFATS risk assessments compare to the work at those other agencies?
Well, there's a couple of examples I can think of. At the Coast Guard, for example, we've done extensive work on their risk assessment model. It's called the Maritime Security Risk Assessment Model, and it does include all the components, and that is probably the most sophisticated model within DHS because it also takes into account the mitigation efforts that a facility is doing and how that impacts the risk. There have been other cases, I believe it's TSA, I'll have to correct my statement if I find that's a different agency, where we found that vulnerability was also being held constant, and we've made those recommendations that they not do that, and that particular component agreed with that recommendation.
Thank you. During the first panel, Mr. Wolf, Director Wolf, indicated that including vulnerability in risk assessments would lead to an ever-changing tier assignment for a given facility. Is this a valid enough reason for leaving the criteria out of the assessment?
Well, I think if in the beginning that was thought through and done on purpose, I could have maybe given them a little more sympathy as trying to design something to do that. But, I mean, as I said, that narrative has developed pretty recently as to why that's left out. There is a problem now in that they've tiered a lot of facilities, thousands of facilities, and if there are major changes in their model because of the peer review or things we've said or adding the economic consequences, this could reasonably change the tiering of those facilities.
And this committee is aware of two mis-tiering incidents at the department where facilities were placed in the wrong tier because of errors made by the department. That's a serious problem. But now we hear from GAO that none of the more than 3,500 tiering decisions that have been made are reliable. They are all based on a risk assessment methodology that is seriously lacking. Is that an accurate assessment?
I wouldn't use the term that this is a fatal flaw or things like that, but certainly we're questioning why they haven't included vulnerability. I think that, so we have a concern. Now, we do believe the best way to address that would be to have a peer review come in, externally review it. As we've said before, and as you said before, the National Academies of Sciences came in and found very similar problems across the department that we're talking about here within the CFATS program.
Well, I see that my time has expired, so I will yield back, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you. Chair now recognizes the gentleman from Pennsylvania, Mr. Pitts, for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Mr. Caldwell, you noted in your statement that it could take 7 to 9 years before ISCD completes the review of the 3,120 security plans currently in the review queue, and that the estimate does not include work by ISCD on other mission activities. What are some examples of these ISCD activities?
Well, that estimate does not include about 900 facilities that have yet to be assigned into a final tier. Also, the time required to review the plans to resolve issues related to personal surety takes some time because a lot of the some of the plans have been provisionally or conditionally approved, so they have to go back and revisit that once the personal surety rule is in place. And then there's the compliance inspections that they would do, which are separate from the plan approval, but those are generally done a year after. So you're looking at another year out there for individual facilities before they have the compliance inspections. And really, it's only until you have the compliance inspection whether you know that the facility is actually implementing the things in its security plan.
So will implementing these mission activities further delay full CFATS program implementation?
Well, certainly until all the pieces are in place, it's not going to be there. And I think several figures have been thrown out, 8 to 10 years, we said in our last hearing. I mean, now we're looking at 7 to 9 just for the approval plan. So it's going to be some time before this regime is completely in place, just in contrast to maybe some of the other programs that were put in place after 9/11.
Now, the regulated industry says that ISCD's efforts to communicate regarding CFATS-related issues are mixed in effectiveness. Does ISCD measure the effectiveness of its outreach efforts, and could they?
No, they don't. They don't really. They measure some of the things like how many meetings they have and those kinds of things, but they have an outreach to really find out whether these have been effective. So we are considering.
Should they or could they?
Yes, and we are considering a recommendation with the department. We're in discussions with a recommendation that would ask that they do so.
What should we take away from the input that you got from trade associations?
Some of the things are working pretty well. The meetings with the Sector Coordinating Council seem to be effective, according to industry. Also, some of the visits to facilities, a little bit mixed there. I think the more recent things based on some of the testimony you'll hear later today is that the officials doing those inspections from DHS do seem qualified and helpful, whereas I think some of the early responses that they were very reluctant to actually make useful, concrete suggestions on how to improve security.
Now, you found that owners and operators were spending unnecessary resources complying with CFATS data collection requirements. Would you elaborate on that?
I don't believe we ever said they were unnecessary. I just think they were worried about a substantial burden in terms of the cost it was taking to do these, particularly if something changed and they did this. I think one of the things the industry may tell you about in the next panel is the chemical industry can be a complicated business, so sometimes they change mixes of their chemicals in terms of some of their processes, and there's been a debate about whether then do they have to go back to DHS and resubmit everything because their mixture of chemicals is slightly different. That's a concern.
And what, in your view, is the difference between the current site security plans and alternative security plans?
Well, I think the alternative security plans look a little simpler. I think that they have some of the same information, but perhaps in a more useful way because it's portrayed as a plan as opposed to a data dump of a lot of individual information that's in the DHS tool.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you, Chair. Now recognize the gentleman from California, Mr. McNerney, for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Mr. Caldwell, we've been hearing this morning a lot about tiering formulas and about the risk assessment models. How familiar are you with the details of these models and formulas?
We have not done the kind of verification and validation that a peer review of experts might do. So we have talked through what they use. We've discussed the factors, but I can't say we have tried to reproduce their models or do sensitivity analysis.
Are these by and large Excel spreadsheets, or what do they look like, or what form do they take, or how do people assess have access to the models?
It's an online tool, so it's some kind of relational database, but beyond that, I can't tell you too much about the formulas or what the actual algorithms are.
And what sort of security do the models have in terms of making changes to parameters, not parameters, but the way the models are executed? Is there a very secure methodology that's required for someone within DHS to change the model itself?
We have not looked at the internal controls or the security settings on the model.
So as far as you know, somebody in one of these departments can say, well, geez, I think this model's a little off, I'm going to change it, and there has to be some sort of control on these things.
There should be, yes, sir.
Is that something you think you can find out or make?
We can certainly ask the department and answer that as a question for the record, or you could direct it to the department, and that might expedite things,
Okay.
or not.
All right, thank you. I have a question. Were you assured by the Undersecretary's declaration that they had the best teams on cybersecurity and that they were on top of this issue and we don't have anything to worry about?
That's not an aspect we looked at, so I have no comments on that.
So cybersecurity is not within your sort of realm of...
It's one of many of the standards that they apply here. We do have other experts in GAO on cybersecurity that if you want to ask us a question for the record, we might be able to take that and answer for you, sir.
All right, thank you. That's all I have, Mr. Chairman.
The Chair thanks the gentleman. Chair now recognizes, I believe, the gentleman from Ohio, Mr. Latta, for 5 minutes.
Well, thank you very much, Mr. Chairman, and thank you very much for being here. And we've got a couple of hearings going on, so I'm sorry that we're kind of in and out today. But if I could start with this question, how important is it for the Infrastructure Security Compliance Division to have the complete, validated, and verified risk assessment approach?
I mean, I think our position is that the current approach is incomplete. So to the extent that they're using an incomplete model, they don't have an assurance that they're tiering these in the right fashion, appropriate with the National Infrastructure Protection Plan's criteria, which is pretty much the department's, criteria in terms of how you do risk assessments.
So how would you have to go about to get that complete?
You'd have to include vulnerability in it, and economic consequences are maybe the two minimum things that would need to be added into it. We've also asked that they update some of their threat data. Some of the threat data they were using was a few years old, which they've agreed to do.
Okay, thank you. Also, how important is it for the ISCD to eventually conduct an independent peer review on CFATS risk assessment approach?
We think it's very critical that there be an independent peer review, and I think you might have missed my answer talking to the chairman a few minutes ago, but there's really two factors. One is to make sure they have the methodology right, and secondly, to make sure the model, once you have the methodology right, or at least with the existing methodology, is the model actually functioning as intended. And as we've noted, there's been some miscalculations in the model that have been found, which should, again, call for doing a verification and validation of the model itself.
And just to follow up on that, how soon should that independent peer review occur?
Well, I think it's already started, or at least the panel that they have now. I think there's a statement in Mr. Beer's written comments that if they need to do a second one, they're willing to do that as well. So the first one may be to find out where they are now, make some recommendations, and maybe it would require a second peer review to actually go in and validate the model with any changes.
Okay. Mr. Chairman, I have no further questions. Thank you.
And Chair thanks the gentleman. Chair now recognizes the gentleman from Florida, Mr. Bill Rackus, for 5 minutes.
The alternative security plans are written more like a plan. The document, the site security plan that DHS has, is more maybe I'd describe it more as a data dump. It's a lot of different data that's in there. I mean, both can be useful, but I think industry feels, and you can ask the third panel, that the alternative site plan or alternative security plan is a little more user-friendly and still gets you there in the end.
Anyone, seeing no other members present, we would like to thank you, Mr. Caldwell, for appearing before us. You've done great work on this report. It looks like we got a lot more work to do, and with that, we'll allow the second panel to be dismissed and ask the third panel to join us at the table. Thank you, sir.
Thank you very much.
We want to thank the third panel for joining us and sitting through most of the testimony. I'm sure that's going to be helpful in the remaining members as we listen to your opening statements and direct questions. And we'll do so now. The first person that I'd like to recognize is, I'm going to recognize Mr. Allman. That's okay, Jerry. I'm great. Mr. Allman, who is Vice President of Society of Chemical Manufacturers and Affiliates. Sir, you're recognized for 5 minutes. Your full statement's in the record.
Thank you, and good morning, Chairman Shimkus, Ranking Member Tonko, and members of the subcommittee. My name is Bill Allman, and I'm the Vice President of Government and Public Relations at the Society of Chemical Manufacturers and Affiliates. I'm pleased to have the opportunity to provide you with an update on the Department of Homeland Security's implementation of CFATS from the perspective of specialty chemical manufacturers, many of which are small and medium-sized companies. Since the previous hearing last September, there are several areas we feel are worthy to highlight in terms of implementation progress. First, CFATS continues to reduce risk. Second, authorizing inspections are revealing some positives about DHS's implementation, but also some challenges for small and medium-sized facilities. Lastly, collaboration with the regulated community has improved. With respect to risk reduction, CFATS continues to drive facilities to reduce inherent hazards, where, in their expert judgment, doing so is in fact safer, does not transfer risk to some other point in the supply chain, and makes economic sense. Today, nearly 3,000 facilities have changed processes or inventories in ways that have enabled them to screen out of the regulation. Furthermore, due to the outstanding cooperation of the chemical sector, there's been 100% compliance with the requirements to date. DHS has not yet had to institute a single administrative penalty action to enforce compliance. As a result of CFATS, our nation is more secure from terrorist chemical attacks than it was before the regulation's inception. Turning to DHS's inspection process, the few that so far have been conducted at SOCMA members reveal some positive aspects about how the department is carrying out the regulation, as well as some challenges being presented among small and medium-sized facilities. Among the positives is the level of interaction of DHS inspectors with facilities scheduled for an inspection. Inspectors are providing sufficient details with facilities prior to their arrival, which aids the planning process to ensure resources and facility personnel are available. Similarly, facilities are finding DHS inspectors generally to be reasonable during the on-site inspection, which is perhaps due to the fact that some of them have chemical facility experience. Such operational familiarity is necessary when interpreting how risk-based performance standards apply to and could be implemented at such facilities. Importantly, inspections have so far appropriately verified a facility's approach to addressing risk-based performance standards. Inspectors appear not to be adhering rigidly to the RBPS guidance and instead to permitting company personnel to explain from the facility perspective how they are appropriately implementing their site security plan. The principal challenge that SOCMA's smaller facilities are finding with the inspection process, however, is the enormous amount of time and resources to meet DHS demands following an inspection. Of highest concern is an unwillingness by DHS to reasonably extend deadlines for facility response. In Stockman's opinion, DHS should be more willing to extend the time of which a small and medium-sized facilities has to respond to a post-inspection report. Facilities are learning that even if they had an inspection that went well, they're having to rewrite much of their site security plans. Under a 30-day deadline, which has been the usual case, facilities are having to pull 2 to 3 workers for 2 to 3 days each to ensure they meet the deadline. To us, this is unreasonable. In small companies, there simply may not be more than a few people qualified to work on security measures, and all of those people have other obligations, which frequently include compliance with other regulatory programs. It is still early in the inspections process, and these burdens are now coming to light. However, DHS still has time to make adjustments given a willingness to do so. Lastly, collaboration with facilities on implementation has improved. We are pleased that DHS has recently worked with industry to establish an alternative security program template with possibly more in the future. Additionally, DHS appears prepared this year to co-host another chemical sector security summit. For the past 6 years, the summit has been a collaborative effort by the department and the chemical sector to provide an educational forum for CFATS stakeholders. An overwhelming majority of attendees each year are industry personnel, who in satisfaction surveys consistently rate the summit as having a high value to them. Many of the improvements over the past year have occurred under the leadership of Deputy Undersecretary Suzanne Spalding and Director David Wolf, and their actions to help put CFATS back on track is worthy of recognition. I appreciate the opportunity to testify this morning, and I look forward to your questions.
Thank you very much. I'd now like to recognize, as I move my papers all around, who's next? Here it is. Mr. Timothy Scott, Chief Security Officer and Corporate Director at Dow Chemical Company, on behalf of the American Chemistry Council. Sir, you're recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you. Chairman Shimkus, Ranking Member Tonko, and members of the subcommittee, I'm Tim Scott, Chief Security Officer of the Dow Chemical Company, speaking today on behalf of Dow and the American Chemistry Council. The chemical industry and Department of Homeland Security have a common goal to improve the security profile of the chemical sector and reduce the risk of attack against industry or the use of chemicals as a weapon. Our positions are that security is a top priority of the chemical industry. Progress has been made in all areas of chemical security, but there is still obviously work to be done. ACC will continue to partner with DHS to achieve success, and we need the certainty of a multi-year extension of DHS authority for a sustainable program. Progress has been made, and we need to build on that progress as respectful partners with different skills and expertise, but with a common goal. DHS has evaluated nearly 40,000 chemical facilities across the United States, initially identifying more than 7,000 as potentially high risk. Since then, more than 3,000 facilities have lowered their chemical risk profile, clear evidence that we have made progress. Last year, ACC published an alternative security program guidance document available at no cost to the regulated community, the result of a year-long effort in full cooperation with DHS. This ASP approach offers an efficient alternative to the DHS process and is an excellent example of how an effective public-private partnership can create smart regulatory solutions that benefit both partners while ensuring the security and safety of our industry. While we have made progress, there are many more opportunities for efficient and effective compliance options that will accelerate CFATS implementation while maintaining the quality and integrity of the program. Existing industry security programs such as the Responsible Care Security Code should be recognized by DHS under their ASP authority as meeting the initial hurdles for authorization, thus streamlining and prioritizing reviews, especially at the lower-tiered sites. We must develop a workable process regarding personnel surety. The goal of the PSP program is to ensure that personnel accessing sensitive sites of high-risk chemical facilities are trustworthy and do not pose a security risk. It is essential that these individuals are properly vetted against the terrorist screening database. We all agree on that. But it's also essential that the site know these individuals are cleared before granting access to such sensitive areas. Under the current proposals, industry submits the individual's personal information and receives no verification of any kind. We are supposed to be satisfied that simply submitting the data is enough to grant site access. This is simply a poor security practice, especially when solutions already exist. It's good to hear that we may be making progress in this area with DHS. By leveraging existing PSP programs and allowing for corporate and third-party submissions for vetting against the terrorist screening database, a significant reporting burden will be minimized and the integrity of the program will be much improved. Another opportunity for efficiency that can easily be implemented is in what we call corporate audits. These audits cover areas of the risk-based performance standards in which many company sites operate under a single corporate process, such as cybersecurity or security escalation processes. Current inspections often have inspectors getting the same corporate answers site by site instead of addressing the issue once at the corporate level. This can unnecessarily extend the length of a site inspection. We also heard that DHS is working on this. ACC believes that DHS should be more transparent about all factors related to a covered facility's risk assessment. Trust is at the core of an effective security partnership, and ACC strongly recommends that DHS improve the transparency of its risk determinations with the site security managers. A lack of transparency has been the source for many of the inefficiencies and missteps during the CFATS implementation. The CFATS concept is fundamentally sound, risk-based, focused on the right priorities, allowing regulated sites to choose and apply customized security solutions for DHS review and evaluation for compliance with the DHS established risk-based performance standards. And that is the goal, to meet the standards, and industry will. DHS has demonstrated renewed commitment and effort to our partnership, due in part by oversight of this committee. ACC urges Congress to provide DHS extended statutory authority for the CFATS program to provide the regulatory certainty and stability needed for industry to make prudent security investment and capital planning decisions. Industry and DHS have made progress in improving the security of the chemical sector. There have been missteps, but we should acknowledge the progress and the challenge and commit to making CFATS work. Thank you.
Thank you. Next, I'd like to recognize Mr. Charlie Drevna, President, American Fuel and Petrochemical Manufacturers. Sir, you're recognized for 5 minutes.
Chairman Shimkus, Ranking Member Tonko, and members of the subcommittee, thank you for giving me the opportunity to testify today on today's hearing on a progress report of the CFATS program. I am Charlie Drevna, and I serve as president of AFPM. We are a 111-year-old trade association representing high-tech American manufacturers that use oil and natural gas liquids as raw materials to make virtually the entire supply of U.S. gasoline, diesel, jet fuel, other fuels as home heating oil, as well as the petrochemicals used as building blocks for thousands of products vital in everyone's daily lives. America's refining and petrochemical companies play a pivotal role in ensuring and maintaining the security of America's energy and petrochemical infrastructure. Nothing is more important to AFPM member companies than the safety and security of our employees, facilities, and communities. Our members have worked extensively with the Department of Homeland Security, and we've invested hundreds of millions of dollars. And we don't mind investing the money as long as we know it's going for the right reasons. And again, towards strengthening facility security. Our industry also recognizes the protection of critical infrastructure against potential threats or terrorist attacks should be a shared responsibility between government, state, and stakeholders. AFPM appreciates that DHS conducted an internal review to identify administrative and implementation problems that require immediate action, and that the agency developed an action plan for improving CFATS implementation. It is important, however, to recognize that the structure of the CFATS framework itself is sound. And even though the leaked report from GAO revealed the implementation of CFATS program was somewhat flawed. Additionally, America's critical infrastructure facilities are secure, and there have been no attacks on chemical facilities since development of the CFATS program. Nonetheless, it is clear that DHS need to better manage its resources and set priorities to make progress in areas that need immediate action, including faster approval of site security plans and finalizing a workable personal surety program, the PSP. Such measures would work to strengthen the program and our national security. AFPM believes that DHS has made progress over the past year to address the problems identified in the DHS leaked report and action plan. However, DHS should continue to make improvements by addressing issues including personal surety with the help of the industry in order to enhance the overall effectiveness of CFATS implementation in the short term. AFPM is pleased that DHS withdrew the personal surety proposal from the Office of Management and Budget last July, and then held a series of meetings with industry to take another look at this issue. Congress intended, and I heard today a repeat of that intent, that the risk-based performance standard on personal security, which governs access to high-risk facility, allow facilities the flexibility to determine the most efficient manner to meet that standard. Instead, DHS initially proposed an arguably prescribed PSP program that failed to recognize the Transportation Worker Identification Credential, or TWIC card, and other established federal vetting programs. Such a program would have been burdensome to both DHS and industry and would be a wasteful and ineffective use of agency and industry resources. Instead of proposing a duplicative, burdensome PSP, DHS should remain focused on fixing the current problems and not expand beyond the scopes of the core CFATS program. The PSP program must be fixed soon, and we hope that DHS will honor the TWIC and other federal credentials at CFATS sites. Facilities should have the option to use federally secure vetting programs such as TWIC to satisfy CFATS without submitting additional personnel information. AFPM supports a PSP program that requires only a one-time submission of a personnel identifying information to DHS, recognition of TWIC and other federal credentials, and the use of third-party submitters for corporate submissions. This would lessen the burden on both DHS and industry and would potentially account for half the population affected by the personal security program, specifically contractors coming to CFAT sites who would already have those cards. Stakeholder industry input is necessary. To assist DHS in addressing the CFATS implementation challenges, continued stakeholder input is necessary. We are encouraged that we're seeing DHS do this more and more. In summary, AFPM believes that DHS has made progress over the year addressing the problems identified in the internal report. We also acknowledge that there has been far greater outreach and more detailed discussions with DHS, and we hope that those continue in the future. Thank you, and I look forward to any questions you may have regarding my testimony.
Thank you. Now the Chair recognizes Mr. Rick Hind, Legislative Director for Greenpeace. Sir, you're recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. My name is Rick Hind. I'm the Legislative Director of Greenpeace, as you mentioned. I appreciate the opportunity to talk to you today, both to this committee and with this panel here. We work with over 100 other organizations, mainly unions, environmental justice organizations, other environmental groups, security experts, 9/11 families, and others who for 10 years have pushed for disaster prevention. The legislation that passed the House in 2009, November actually 2009, had that component in it, but it also addressed a lot of the problems that you've been hearing about today. It provided for regular scheduling of the DHS issuing vulnerability and security plans, as well as keeping regular reports back to Congress. I think you probably would have been hearing about any of these problems in 2011 at the latest if that legislation had been enacted in 2010. That legislation also would have seamlessly replaced the 2006 authorization that you referred to earlier, which was never really thought to be adequate. Everybody knew that, and that's why it had a 3-year expiration date on it. And today we're extending it now 6 years, 1 or so years at a time. And therefore, I think you have, I think appropriately, given the due that DHS staff deserve, their dedication and stick-to-itiveness in a program that is really inadequate, from the legislative foundation through to the continuity of its funding by Congress. However, the kind of big elephants in the room that we see unaddressed are the fact that the statute actually prohibits the government from requiring disaster prevention in the statute, barring any particular security measure for approval of security plans. In addition, the statute actually exempts thousands of facilities. So what we're talking about here, when you think of the classic Bhopal disaster of poison gas drifting out of a plant endangering people, and in this country we have hundreds of plants that can do that. In looking at the tiering of DHS, if you separate that by risk issue, or I should say security issue, The release issue security facilities in tiers 1 and 2 totals 35. That's totally in all 4 tiers, 370 facilities. That data is 2011, so it may be slightly less now. The point is that less than 10% of the facilities that you think of as the 3,900 CFATS facilities may be chemical disasters in the sense we all think of it as. And that's because they're being regulated by other programs like the MTSA, which look at more the water access of the facility. Major facilities in the country, like this Keeney plant, probably the highest risk facility in the United States, is regulated by MTSA. That facility puts 12 million people at risk. They, for 2 years on their website, say they're converting. We hope they are. Clorox converted in all of their facilities in 3 years, eliminating these risks to 13 million people. And we say risk, we mean, in consequence, we mean a poison gas like chlorine that can drift 14 to 20 miles from a facility and put everyone downwind in danger of pulmonary edema, which would mean your lungs would literally melt. You would drown in your lung fluid. Those who would survive could have long-lasting, lifelong health problems. So when we hear about the rush to approve security plans now, and we're not comforted by the 7 to 9 year schedule GAO brings out, we're also not comforted by the fact that it's not a complete deck that we're dealing with here. So approval of a plan doesn't necessarily make it secure, and it certainly doesn't make it no longer vulnerable. The CEO of DuPont admitted that an airplane or a small helicopter coming into a plant couldn't be stopped by fence line security, which is the entire basis of this kind of security. Similar communities living near these plants are not comforted by these alternative security plans developed by industry lobbies. They've heard too often when they've sheltered in place or seen explosions and flares and fires, or averaging about 45 a year, by the way, at refineries, that everything's okay, there's no dangerous levels of chemicals released. So when you look at our testimony, look at the people who we've quoted in there, but also look at the Center for American Progress reports we cited, which identified hundreds of facilities that have converted and eliminated these risks to millions of people. We think any plant that can convert should be required to convert. And in fact, the CAP studies found that 87% of those converted that were surveyed did so for $1 million or less. A third expected to save money. So this is good business. It also means eliminating liability and regulatory obligations. And I have much more to say, but I'll wait for your questions. Thank you again for allowing us to appear today.
Thank you, Mr. Hine. Now I'd like to recognize myself for the first 5 minutes of questions. I want to start off whatever script I was given to ask Mr. Scott a question. Were you in the room when Representative McKinley was asking about the risk assessment issue? And of course, DHS responded that, well, we don't know of any identifiable risks. Then the question went, I'm paraphrasing here, then the question went to about European security, and DHS responded, well, we think we're the gold standard. Since you operate around the globe, does individual European countries or the EU at large have a CFATS type program?
No, but they're discussing a similar program. The difference you have there, you're working between various countries, but they do have regulations in place, like the CFATS regulations that are impact off-site types of emergencies. EU is having a conversation about are there any general rules and regulations that we can put in place. They have been talking. They have talked with DHS in the past. We are working with...
Maybe they should talk with our GAO. Our government accounting office than DHS. Well,
DHS is a standard. I wouldn't say it was a gold standard. But the folks overseas are looking at similar directions to go, both in transportation and site security. But we also have a lot of work that we've done over there through the Responsible Care Code is a global code. So that's been implemented, and a lot of the same safety and security cultures that are in place in the U.S. are in place throughout Europe.
Great, appreciate that. Now, for Mr. Allman, Mr. Scott, and Mr. Drevna, GAO reports, and you all heard these conversations earlier today, that DHS largely disregards vulnerability, economic criticality, and threat assessments as part of their risk calculations, making CFATS a modified consequence prevention-only program. Are you concerned your members might be overregulated or under-tiered, Mr. Allman?
Well, certainly these revelations are concerning, and it's going to take me some time to get back to my members to find out from their perspective how they would like to proceed. I think completely stopping the CFATS program from going forward probably would be overboard. Perhaps some components could go forward, but certainly.
Okay, but you were here in the testimony. Do you think that some of your folks are overregulated or under-tiered? It's pretty easy.
At this point, it seems like that may be the case.
Thank you, Mr. Scott.
I would say yes. Looking at the variability in the sites that we have that are covered, there's a lot of question in how we got where we got.
Mr. Drevna.
I concur.
You've heard from panels 1 and 2 that DHS has collected a lot of information that it will not use in risk assessment. Are you comfortable with that, Mr. Allman?
No, we are not.
And why?
That DHS should use the information that's given them. As has been testified before, there's been an enormous amount of resources given to from our side, given to the department that we're compelled to do, and there's an understanding that the department is going to use that information.
Mr. Scott.
I agree. The inefficiency in the process caused a lot of unnecessary work, a lot of information that they've never used, and we don't know where the information went. It seems like they felt like they had the answer before we started the process.
Mr. Drevna.
Yes, and I would like to add to that, Chairman Shim, I'd like to add to that in chemical facilities, you're changing processes constantly. So we're submitting information. It goes somewhere. Lots of information, over 900 questions on some things. It goes somewhere, whether it's used or not, probably not, all of it. Again, if it's vital, perfect. If it's not, let us work with you to get it done. But then you change your process again, you may have to go through the whole thing again, because these things are not static kinds of plants. We're always changing volumes and chemicals.
Mr. Scott?
I would like to add to that. That's one of the big issues that we have is we typically have larger plants, a lot of processes in those plants, and we are required to submit anytime we change anything in the process, make another submission. That puts you back to square one in the whole process. So
yeah, and just because my time's getting short, and Mr. McNerney's not here, but he talked a lot about cyber stuff. So you've got all this data going somewhere. If it's not being used, why it's being held, and what's the risk of that being pulled out to be actually to make your facilities less secure? Is that a risk, Mr. Scott?
Well, it is a risk whenever you release the information that you hope that it's going to be secured. But in the earlier panel, we also heard that, well, maybe we can declassify that so everybody can talk about it. And I'm concerned about the level of declassification. If it's just open to the public, that's a real security concern.
Anyone else while my time's expired? Mr. Drevna?
I would like to add to that, you're probably one hit of forward or reply all from exactly what Mr. Scott has just talked about.
Absolutely.
Mr. Allman, okay, thank you. Chair now recognizes Ranking Member Mr. Tonko for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chair, and to the gentlemen on the panel, thank you for your time and your input today. To the industry witnesses, did you participate in GAO's survey?
Oh, SOCMA did, yes.
ACC did, yes.
Yes, sir.
So you all did. GAO found that transparency in the tiering process should be improved. Can each of you state whether you agree with this GAO conclusion?
I'll say absolutely. As Mr. Scott was saying, a lot of times these facilities give information without getting a really detailed understanding about why they got the tier level they did.
All the information was submitted. I absolutely. I think it should be more transparent with the people that we were supposed to be working as partners.
And I agree, Mr. Tonko. But I will say that the process has somewhat improved. I mean, we've got a long way to go, but we weren't where we were before this report came out.
Now, Mr. Drevno, you talked about the PSP process and utilizing it more readily.
Yes, sir.
Can you just develop that a bit for me?
Well, we have at refineries and petrochemical facilities, you have constantly, your own employees, but you have constant, contractors coming in at turnarounds, changeovers, et cetera, and they're authorized. The contractors under the TWIC, the Transportation Worker Identification Credentials. And what the DHS will tell us is that, well, we're coming up with a remedy for that, but those rules aren't going to be ready for who knows how many more years. Meanwhile, we have to perhaps have other identification notices or identification cards for the various employees and contractors. It's sort of like, if I can make some sort of analogy, it's sort of like you going to an airport, and you have to have your passport to go through the first gate, and your driver's license to go through the second, and maybe your voter ID card to go through the third, or whatever. But it doesn't make any sense. So, you talk to us in industry, and we usually object to the one-size-fits-all approach, and maybe that's not applicable, but we need something that is not duplicative, time-consuming, and sometimes conflicting.
Thank you, Mr. Drevno. Mr. Hind, you made mention, or I think to use your words, we're not dealing with the complete deck. Can you elaborate on that? What else should be done to make certain that we're providing for the public safety elements out there, or in keeping with the mission of the legislation?
Well, if you look at the EPA's database for its risk management program, which is really kind of an imperfect, larger universe of the facilities we're worried about, those that have off-site consequences, the total number of facilities in that program is 12,440, according to CRS's latest update in November. Of those, 2,500 plants each put 10,000 people or more at risk. 2,500, some of them could put over 1 million at risk. In fact, 473 put 100,000 at risk. And so my question to the panelists here is, which of your member companies are actually part of MTSA and exempt from CFATS, or part of a DOE program, or even Defense Department? And I think that the numbers would be rather revealing in terms of which they are. We've heard that Dow's largest plant in the country at Freeport, Texas, is an MTSA facility. So that means there's huge holes, or as Congressman Waxman called them, gaps in the security and in terms of the continuity of security by the government and accountability over the industry.
Thank you. And from the public interest perspective, what are the problems with incorrect tiering of facilities?
You mean in terms of the way that the risk assessment has been conducted and so forth? Well, in our view, we're a little bit nervous to hear about economic considerations being added and also vulnerability. I think that all of these facilities are vulnerable. If somebody takes a small plane or hijack, all of the guards and cameras and gates are not going to be enough to stop a small plane, as CEO of DuPont admitted years ago. So I think that we're, as the former EPA of Administrator Ruckelshaus warned, risk assessment is like a captured spy. If you torture it enough, you can get it to say anything. And I fear that we're going down a slippery slope here, and what needs to be done is adding alternatives assessment to the process. Each company should be going out and saying to the DHS, we've looked at all the alternatives and there's nothing feasible for our facility, or we're like Clorox and we can convert. And then you have zero risk.
Thank you. I think some of you might have had a comment to that too. Or?
Yeah,
without objection, we'll continue for a minute to get a response. Mr. Scott?
I'd just like to reply on the MTSA question. There are several sites that are covered by MTSA, but rightly so, they have waterside security included on their security. But the Texas operations site is the one that Mr. Hines mentioned, which is our largest site. It's the largest chemical site in the United States. It is covered by MTSA, so it does have different requirements. It also has exactly the same security upgrades already in place that are required of a Tier 1 CFATS sites. So if you come down to Freeport operations or Texas operations, you'll see we would be in full compliance with CFATS right now as a Tier 1 site. All of our MTSA sites are upgraded security-wise exactly the same as our CFATS sites, and all of our sites globally are tiered the same way and have security upgrades in place the same way. So I think that addresses the issue that we can have integration of the two systems very well.
Thank you very much. Chair now recognizes the gentleman from Pennsylvania, Mr. Pitts, for 5 minutes.
Mr. Drebna, did you want to add to that?
Well, if you don't mind, Mr. Chairman, thank you. You know, I agree with everything that Mr. Scott has said in exponentially. But since the question was asked from the panel to the panel, you know, in short of installing Patriot missile batteries at all facilities, I don't see how we're going to stop anything from coming in from outside the gate like an airplane or a helicopter.
Mr. Alman, you testify that DHS should be more willing to extend the amount of time smaller, medium-sized facility has to respond to a post-inspection report. How much time is reasonable so that the small and medium-sized facility still feels the urge to promptly respond while also giving them the chance to provide a quality response?
Yes, thank you for that question. I think a minimum of 90 days would be sufficient.
Do you believe DHS still has time to make program adjustments and will consider your perspective? And if so, what gives you that confidence?
I do. In fact, I've already broached this concern with the department, and they've been receptive to hearing our proposal.
Thank you. Mr. Drebna, your testimony discusses the importance your members place on getting a workable personnel security program. Is DHS addressing your particular concerns?
Well, we have been working with them, and as I said previously, ever since the report came out, and we've sat down, and I have to admit there's been more transparency, and they're willing to work with us, but we've got to establish the fact that as I said before, the TWIC reader card implementation is years away, but we're in the process of doing all this now. So there has to be some meeting of the minds here that says, okay, let's get this done in a timely fashion so we can move on.
Has AFPM tried to get an alternative security plan approved by DHS for its members? What has been your experience with DHS in trying to advance?
Well, we support the alternative plans. We haven't particularly as an association done it, but our members have, and that's one of the things we keep the tiering process, the kind of data that's needed, a little bit confusing between what's needed for the full assessment, what's needed for a to get you into a quicker AV alternative plan. So we're working with them. We support it, and again, we're seeing light at the end of this tunnel, but we still have a ways to go.
Assuming DHS, with help from peer review panel, comes up with a better risk assessment model, when should it be applied to CFATS activities? Does it affect the speed with which your members would have their site security plans reviewed and approved?
Is that for me, sir?
Yeah.
I believe it would. I mean, we have 3 members on that, 3 member companies on that tiering panel, and we're confident that we're getting joint cooperation. Anytime you can get 3 companies on a panel and a government panel, we're happy with that. But the proof's going to be at the end of the day what's accepted and what isn't.
All right, Mr. Scott, your testimony raised concerns about transparency by DHS officials because they did a poor job of communicating threat information to CFATS regulated facilities. Do you think DHS can formulate credible threat information and assessments?
I think they can give us the information that they have available to us. There's a NIAC study out that's on communications amongst the intelligence communities in the D.C. area, and DHS did not come out very highly on that panel.
Does it surprise you that GAO found that DHS really doesn't assess threat for 90% of terror threats at facilities with chemicals?
threat typically is not discussed, and when you have a meeting with DHS, typically it starts with there are no credible threats to the chemical industry at this time. We go on the premise that because we are part of the critical infrastructure, we are a potential threat, or there is always a potential threat. That's the discussion that we've always had.
What recommendations do you have for DHS to improve its threat characterizations and communications?
You have to identify the baseline on the threats that you're going to address, and then you have to have plans in place to escalate your security programs accordingly as the risk increases.
Do you agree with GAO that DHS assessment tools, particularly threat consequence and vulnerability ones, should be verified and valid before being deployed?
Yes, I do. Validity is important, yes.
My time's expired. Thank you.
Gentleman's time has expired. Chair, and I recognize the gentleman from Texas, Mr. Green, for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. And obviously, our threat assessment's a work in progress, because I remember in late 2001, there was in one of the caves in Afghanistan, there was information on a attack on a refinery in Pasadena, California. Didn't take too long to know there's no refineries in Pasadena, California. But I represent Pasadena, Texas, and we have no shortage of refineries. And that was right after 9/11. Obviously, it was infancy. And today, though, there's a lot, and I know at least in the industries I work with in my area in East Harris County, the coordination between the federal agencies and our local police agencies is amazing. Now, I don't know what DHS does, but with the local law enforcement, the FBI, the Customs Border Protection, the Coast Guard. In fact, I was at the Coast Guard facility in our district that now is co-located at a Coast Guard facility with the Harris County Sheriff's Office boats, along with the Houston Police Department boats at the same location in our district in Galena Park, Texas. So, I mean, it's a work in progress. And first thing, were y'all here for the first panel? Do you feel confident that we're going to end up not having to jump through second hoops on your non-MTSA facilities, that the TWIC card is going to be able to be used? If you have a site that Dow does, for example, in Freeport, that the TWIC card works, and you have a land-based site, the TWIC card will also, ultimately when they get through, will also be able to be used for ID at that land-based facility for Dow?
That's the direction that they're moving in. So yes, the TWIC card would be acceptable and usable at any of those sites. Yeah.
Well, Mr. Chairman, we need to just monitor that, because I know we've in this subcommittee had that discussion for a number of years, and frankly, we probably wouldn't have gotten where we are without a great GAO study to show that the problems within DHS. Both for Mr. DeRiva and Mr. Scott, over the past year, have you seen changes in outreach and cooperation from DHS and the industry, particularly as they relate to chemical and fuel and petrochemical manufacturers in the last year?
Yes, in the last year, they have significantly improved the communications from DHS to the people in the field, and from the people in the field to the sites, yes.
Well, and I understand your testimony and your concern that the transparency on the decision-making ought to be much better, and our committee ought to be encouraging that. Now, I do have some concern about the information you provided on your plant facilities, because, again, the experience we have over the last 12 years is that if a lot of your information that's given to DHS is public record, there are folks in part of the world who, can, with a punch of a button, can look up plant design and plant vulnerability. That should not be public record. And I'm concerned about that, that, we want transparency in the approval process, but, as much as I want as much public information for my constituents who live around and work on those plants, I also know I don't want to give a guide to somebody who wants to fly that Piper Cub over it. Is that some of your concern?
Absolutely. We, it's like I said before, Congressman Green. We submit the information, and we submit it in good faith.
And you're required to.
Yeah, but like I say, it's either one reply all or one forward button away from getting into the wrong hands.
Well, I think follow-up hearings, we might have DHS come talk about what they do with the information that's provided, so it is protected. And but I have to admit, Charlie, it's interesting. The ultimate Second Amendment is somebody having a Stinger missile to protect their plant or their house from a Piper Cub flying over it. I don't think we're going to get to that point, but I see planes fly over my plants literally every day when I'm at home, and there's a special protection. No, you have to have special access to be able to fly over those facilities, and no system's foolproof. But I also don't know if I really want us to have to train our plant personnel to have a Stinger missile on their shoulder.
I would concur, Congressman Green.
But, Mr. Chairman, I appreciate the hearing. It seems like we've made progress, but obviously DHS needs to come a little more, more with plants who have, as I said before, have made $1 million in federal tax dollars, $millions investment in partnerships with our local communities that we still don't know what hoops and what will be approved, whether it be tier 1, 2, 3, or 4. And I'd like to have, some certainty there. And I know Greenpeace would like that too, and so would my constituents. Thank you.
Gentleman yields back his time. We want to thank the third panel for being here and ask unanimous consent for 5 days for the subcommittee members to submit opening statements for the record without objection, so ordered. We'd also ask unanimous consent for 10 days to submit written questions for submittal to witnesses for the inclusion in the records. That also pertains to you all. And the inclusion of a letter, ask unanimous consent for the inclusion of a letter from the National Association of Chemical Distributors to myself and Mr. Tonko. Your staff's approved. Dated March 12, 2013 on the CFATS program without objection, so ordered, and the hearing is now adjourned.